why integration still matters, proven benefits, historical lessons, and contemporary trends. And I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for today, Patrice Grimes, who's an associate professor of curriculum instruction and special education at the University of Virginia. So, Patrice, it's all yours.
Thank you. Tom ought to know you can't tell folks 5 minutes when we need 15. But we will do our best to keep things going in a timely way. First of all, I want to thank you very much for including me from the Curry School of Education at UVA here today. And I think it's very important that we cross boundaries in small ways as well as big ones. Because even though I may be up the road in Charlottesville, there are other people as well from Virginia and other communities who are here today. We understand that this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the Richmond region to lead the way in terms of what we're talking about, because there are people in other regions of the Commonwealth as well as other parts of the country that are looking to Richmond at this critical point in time. I appreciate Ed Ayers' remarks. Again, miss having him at UVA, but he's been phenomenal here in Richmond. And I respect when Ed talks about the fluidity of history. And as I was listening last night to Gary Orfield and listening to remarks this morning, I think that's one of the exciting challenges for us in that fluidity, in feeling like we're constantly taking steps forward but steps backward. And so with that motion of back and forth, just want to make a few quick comments before I turn it over to our presenters that I think help me to anchor. There's a lot of information throughout the day. And as a professor of education, I'm constantly telling my students to debrief. Because if we don't take that moment to pause and kind of see what we've said so far, it's an awful lot for us to talk about at 5 o'clock. So just a few things that I've heard just since last night that have helped me begin to frame this, and hopefully will help you too as well. We're talking always about similarities versus differences. There's this constant yin and yang, these tensions and contradictions of what is different and what is similar. And I think to answer one of our questionnaires, I think focusing on where we are similar and where we have more alike than more not alike is a way to help us continue to move forward. Having been in Atlanta for many years, I'm finding this fascinating. I wish this had been done at points earlier in time, and I think you can look to other cities like in Atlanta to see what happened there, what didn't go the way it should have, and Richmond has an incredible opportunity right now to pivot that particular change. But I think at heart we're really talking about the individual versus the institutional. And so in listening to the stories this morning, it's the individual stories that strike our hearts. It's those individual case studies as an educational researcher that speak to me, but yet we're confronted with these institutional issues with which we must deal. So it's this constant sense of working from the top down, but the bottom up. And people always go, well, which should we do? Well, the beauty, but the irony is we've got to do it all at the same time because, as we've said, history doesn't stop and wait, and we're constantly making that happen. And then finally, I think the one thing that we all inherently understand and why we're here, but I think cannot be said enough, is that this topic matters not because of integration for integration in and of itself. Gary Orfield mentioned that last night. It's not about bringing black and white and brown children together to sit next to each other in classrooms for the sake of that. We cannot lose sight of the fact that it's about excellence in education and equity. And if we all focus on having an excellent education for everyone, that's why we'll continue at this for as long as we can. We will instill our children to do it until we get it right. It's the excellence in education that will give all of us equity that is very important. And then last but not least, when we look at the losses and the gains, I think sometimes it's easy to forget the people in those original communities. And I'm partial because my work looks at the history of segregated schooling before Brown v. Board of Ed. And sometimes we talk about people and we start with desegregation in 1954. And I'm so reminded by the late, great Asa Hilliard, as he would tell us when we talked about African American history, don't start with slavery. That it's very important that we move as far into our past as we need to help bring us forward. So as we're talking today, let us remember that while we're talking about creating a more equitable, inclusive, and excellent society, it's about people. people in the past who had their own valued senses of education, who had their own cultural uniquenesses that were brought to it, and you cannot just put people together in a room and expect that because students are side by side, that you're magically going to have something, that it's going to take a concerted effort to preserve the valued education that was based on liberation, participation, and engaging for a citizenry, and blending that to make something new. And the true sense of integration really is taking one and another part and making something that is new and unique, and not one absorbing the other. So with those thoughts in mind, we're now going to switch from more of the personal comments that we had earlier to looking more at an institutional context for this topic. And I'm very privileged and delighted to introduce our three speakers. Jim Ryan is a professor of law at the University of Virginia, and we joke how we've got to leave Charlottesville to be able to meet one another because UVA is so big. Bill Trent, who's very well known for his work in the field of the sociology of education at the University of Illinois-Champaign, Urbana, and he's done quite a bit of work on the successful transition of students from high school to college and structural factors that are essential for us if we're looking at promoting positive educational change. And then Genevieve Siegel-Hawley, who's been one of the key people at the coffee table with organizing this seminar, who's going to look at the area in terms of educational policy and some of the trends and changes that she's seeing in schooling that we will have to contextualize as we look at this larger topic. So Jim will speak first, then Bill, and then Genevieve. And I believe to keep things flowing, each one of them will speak in succession. Then we will definitely allow time for questions. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to begin by thanking Patrice and thanking the conference organizers for including me, and thanking all of you for showing up. I'm going to talk about the Bradley versus Richmond case and focus on the opinion. There's an awful lot that could be said about Bradley versus Richmond, and an awful lot that has been written about it. If you are interested in reading more about it, there's this really nifty book called 5 Miles Away, A World Apart, written by, let me check, James E. Ryan. Like I've told my friends, you could either buy it or read it, but you don't need to do both, and it's probably easier just to buy it. And you might want to buy it before Steven Spielberg returns to town to make another film, because you never know what book. So if you write about law and education like I do, you are sometimes a part historian, sometimes part sociologist. But I am trained as a lawyer and a law professor. And so what I want to do is talk about the legal aspect of Bradley versus Richmond and try to bring you back in time to Judge Marriage and the reasoning that he used in Bradley versus Richmond. Not because it's still the law, it's not. The case was overturned on appeal, and then the Supreme Court tied 4-4, which meant that the Fourth Circuit's decision overturning Judge Marriage's decision stood. And then the law moved on, and the Supreme Court in Milliken versus Bradley in 1974 made it very difficult for school desegregation to cross district lines. I want to bring you back to the legal reasoning because Judge Marriage grappled with two concepts about intent and responsibility that, even though they don't have legal force today, are still pertinent, I think, to how we ought to think about school desegregation. So just by way of background, Judge Marriage took over Bradley versus Richmond, the case in 1970. Not much had happened prior to that point, even though Brown was decided in 1954 and the Bradley case was filed in 1961. Richmond officials were inclined to move as slowly as possible when it came to school desegregation, and the court, at least initially, was not inclined to rush them. Things changed when the Supreme Court decided Green versus New Kent County in 1968 and made it clear that school districts did not simply have to desegregate, that is, stop using race as a factor in school assignments, but they had an obligation to integrate. And then in 1971, the court decided Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which echoed Green's call for maximizing desegregation through integration and approved the use of busing to achieve that goal. The problem was that by 1968, the demographics of Richmond, like the demographics of many cities, had changed pretty dramatically. A majority white district at the time of Brown, it was by 1968 2/3 African American, while Henrico and Chesterfield counties were over 90% white. Confining desegregation to Richmond alone would be futile, if not counterproductive, insofar as it might push more whites to leave the district, especially if busing were ordered. So Judge Marriage, who took over the case, after a 2-month hearing in the summer and early fall of 1971, decided that the 3 districts, Richmond, Henrico, and Chesterfield, ought to be consolidated. The end result would be, or would have been, a 100,000 student school district, 2/3 white, 1/3 black. It was a controversial decision, as you might imagine, and some of you no doubt remember, and Judge Marriage paid a high price personally. Death threats necessitated 24-hour protection by federal marshals. Segregationists spat in his face, threatened his family, shot his dog, and bombed a cottage on his property where his mother-in-law lived. The Klan held weekly parades outside his home, and state and federal legislators called repeatedly for his impeachment. But Judge Marriage was not deterred. In January of 1972, he issued a 325-page opinion ordering consolidation and explaining why. And what I want to do is go through each of those 325 pages one at a time. He offered 3 rationales. I want to focus on the second, but here are all 3, just so you have them. First, the first rationale was that the only way to have an effective remedy, school desegregation remedy, was to combine districts. Busing within Richmond, as I mentioned, was futile and perhaps counterproductive. The Supreme Court had said that school districts that had once segregated by law had a duty to achieve the greatest possible degree of desegregation. That duty, Judge Marriage reasoned, is, quote, not circumscribed by school division boundaries created and maintained by the cooperative efforts of local and central state officials. The need to provide a remedy, in other words, trumped any obligation to respect local political boundaries, which were, as Judge Marriage described, matters of political convenience that had been crossed in the past to maintain segregation. They could be crossed now to promote desegregation. This was a straightforward application of Supreme Court precedent, and indeed ended up receiving 4 votes in Milliken versus Bradley. Unfortunately, it takes 5 votes to make the law. Marriage also concluded that school officials had an obligation to combat residential segregation. He believed, rightly so, that local and state governments had promoted residential segregation, but he focused his attention on school officials and reasoned that they could not simply reproduce the effects of housing segregation in schools, regardless of the cause of housing segregation. School authorities, he reasoned, quote, may not constitutionally arrange an attendance zone system which serves only to reproduce in school facilities the prevalent pattern of housing segregation. This rationale, Marriage acknowledged, would place an ongoing responsibility on school officials to respond to housing segregation, regardless of whether that housing segregation was caused by government action or private discrimination or some combination of the two. In other words, this duty would apply to school districts across the country if followed in other jurisdictions, and it would last as long as there was housing segregation. It's little wonder that New York Times columnist Tom Wicker said at the time that the decision, if it survived appeal, would, quote, prove not just historic but cataclysmic with more and wider practical impact even than Brown. The third rationale rested on Brown's observation that if states provide education, they have an obligation under the Equal Protection Clause to provide it on an equal basis. In a biracial community, Judge Marriage reasoned, meaningful integration is an essential element of securing equality of education. School district officials, thus, in Marriage's view, had an affirmative duty to integrate, not simply desegregate, in order to ensure that students had equal opportunities. Now, I want to return to the second rationale because Judge Marriage's idea of intent and responsibility has literally been lost to history given subsequent developments in the law. Judge Marriage's argument has boiled down to the proposition that school officials intentionally segregate when they create or maintain attendance boundaries, including school district lines, knowing that these will result in segregated schools. Now, the court has said that there's a difference between de jure segregation and de facto segregation, and only de jure segregation is unconstitutional. What Judge Marriage was suggesting, essentially, is that there really is no such thing as de facto school segregation, because school officials, if they do nothing, or if they maintain boundaries, knowing what the result will be, that's segregation by law. That was his view. Now, At first glance, this might seem like a radical conception of intent and responsibility. How could state and local officials be said to intend segregation if they simply draw neighborhood attendance zones and neighborhoods themselves are segregated? These school officials, you might say, intend neighborhood schools, not segregated schools, right? Well, yes and no, and here's a little taste of law school for those of you who have never been. This is probably all you'll want, maybe more than you want. So suppose I'm tired and I want to stretch my arms, but I see that your nose is in my way. Say I stretch my arms anyway. Did I intend to hit your nose? Well, it's a hard question because the answer is yes and no. No, I didn't intend to hit your nose specifically. I intended to stretch my arms. Your nose just happened to be in the way. But surely it wasn't an accident if I knew full well what the result would be. And it doesn't do violence to the idea of intent to say that stretching my arms, knowing that I would hit your nose, means at some level I intended to hit your nose. Nor does it do violence to the concept of responsibility to say that I am fully responsible for hitting your nose. After all, I didn't need to stretch my arms in front of your nose, but I did it anyway, knowing full well what the result would be. And indeed, in many areas of the law assumes that people intend the foreseeable consequences of their actions and are therefore legally responsible for those consequences, either civilly or criminally. This is, in a sense, what Judge Marriage was saying. School officials, he believed, could not pretend that school segregation was simply an accident and beyond their control due to housing discrimination. They knew full well the result of their decisions regarding attendance zones and school district boundaries. If they knew that creating or maintaining those boundaries would result in segregation, Judge Marriage reasoned they should be responsible. But wait, you're thinking, isn't there a huge difference between action and inaction, and so a huge difference between playing around with attendance zones or school district lines and simply doing nothing? And in the Richmond metropolitan area, absent the annexation of Henrico, you could say they just did nothing. That is, the county lines had been there for quite a long time and school district officials did nothing in response. Well, let's go back to law school for a second. What if I see that you're about to spill a glass of wine on yourself, or I see that, don't get nervous, that a ceiling panel is about to fall on your head? Even if I remain silent and the wine spills or the ceiling panel falls, surely no one would say that I intended that to happen, right? Well, yes, but is the answer. It would be wrong in general and as a matter of logic to say that by my doing nothing, I intended for you to spill your wine or get clocked in the head by a falling ceiling tile. But now imagine that I had a duty to protect you. Say you were my child and I saw that you were in danger. If I did nothing, the law might very well hold me responsible, even if I never intended you to be in danger in the first place. Why would the law do this? Because of my duty to protect my child, which includes a duty to protect that child from harm where possible to do so. In a sense, the law treats my inaction as intent to harm the moment I realize my child's in danger and I decide not to do anything about it. Now think of school officials. What duty did they have? They had a duty not to segregate. They had a duty, according to Brown, to provide equal educational opportunities. Under either duty, Judge Marriage reasoned, school officials had a responsibility to avoid segregation where possible to do so. They had an obligation to do something about it. Choosing not to do anything, in other words, was just as much a choice to segregate as actively pursuing that goal. This is an intriguing and still relevant idea, as I'll get to in a minute, but it's not the law. Judge Marriage's opinion, as I mentioned, was overturned by the Fourth Circuit, and the Supreme Court upheld the Fourth Circuit's decision. In addition, the Supreme Court subsequently made clear in a series of cases in the 1970s that for purposes of the Constitution and specifically the Equal Protection Clause, intent means specific intent. To prove intentional segregation, in other words, You have to show that this was a specific goal of the policy. That is, that the point of the policy was to produce segregation. It's not enough to show that you knew segregation would result because of your actions. You have to show that you intended. So to go back to my arm stretching example, the only way you could say under this approach that I intended to hit your nose is that if I stretched my arms because I wanted to clock you in the nose. If I stretched my arms knowing full well that I would hit your nose, under this conception of intent, I didn't intend to hit your nose. So what does this have to do with Richmond today? You're no doubt wondering. Well, under current law, state and local officials are not legally responsible for the segregation that exists today throughout the metropolitan area. But let's be clear, that's not because the text of the Constitution says they're not responsible, nor it's because there's only one conception about intent that's imaginable. It's because the Supreme Court made a choice about how to define intent in the 1970s, and it chose to define intent very narrowly. But just because state and local officials are not legally responsible for the segregation that exists in the metropolitan area does not mean that they are not responsible in fact for it. The lack of legal responsibility does not mean that the segregation that exists is unintentional or accidental in fact. Judge Marriage's view of intent and responsibility, even if they no longer contain legal force, retain a great deal of ethical and logical force. You are making a choice, Judge Marriage reasoned, when you leave segregation untouched, even though it's within your power to do something about it. And with choice comes responsibility. That idea, I think, deserves resurrection because if we want to have an honest conversation about racial and economic segregation, we need to acknowledge that we have so far chosen not to do much about it, even though we could. There may be reasons not to do anything, but we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook so easily by pretending that there's nothing that can be done, by pretending that we don't really have a choice. The choice is ours, it always has been, and we should accept responsibility for the choices we have made. That's what Judge Marriage was saying, and I tend to agree with him. If you disagree, which is your right, of course, I'd only ask that you come a little closer because I feel like I need to stretch my arms.
Good morning, everyone. While he does this, I want to take a personal moment just to say this is home. Richmond, Virginia is, and this is the first time I've been on the University of Richmond campus. So it's taken 68 years to get back home to be able to do this, and I have the great comfort of having even some classmates here. We're graduates of Maggie Walker High School. So with that in mind, I now have to apologize in front if I embarrass any of my classmates by failing to do this in any sense adequately. I want to thank Professor Ryan. That was a brilliant presentation. I really appreciated the points made. So, what I wanted to do with this presentation was to try to make 4 points. First, that segregation matters. There are serious and harmful educational consequences. Resegregation is reestablishing segregation, but in a more intense manner. Desegregation is necessary, but not sufficient to achieve the benefits of diversity. And it is great to have Judge Marriage's quote, to integrate, not just to desegregate. And I'll try to elaborate on that just a bit. because integration should never be conflated to mean no more than desegregation. So how do we go about trying to identify some of these patterns? Resegregation of our schools is a long-term trend. So with the next few slides, I'll present resegregation data for school districts that were under court order to desegregate. And I served as an expert witness in each of these districts, and I'll try to do this as briefly as possible. Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Kansas City, Prince George's County, San Francisco, St. Louis City. 1990 to 2010 data. You can see that in each of those places, the percentage of black students who are in what we call hyper-segregated schools has consistently increased over that time period. The percentage of black students in 50 to 100% minority schools has consistently increased over that time period. And in some places, like Prince George's County, it's now up to 100%. Percentage of Latino students in hyper-segregated schools, similar statistics. Dramatic increases, continuing in very different places across the country. Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Kansas City, Prince George's County, San Francisco, St. Louis City. And again, in 50 to 100% minority schools. So the segregation that we're talking about is still with us. It's with us in Chesterfield County, Henrico County, and Richmond Public Schools from 2001 to 2010. Latino students, similar. So let me show it in one additional way. The segregation that I experienced as a graduate of 1962 was different from the segregation of today. The segregation of today, as you can see, as it increased in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, is not just the segregation by race, but the increasing high poverty rates escalating in schools. And I show just Charlotte, Mecklenburg here and one other example to show that not just the racial composition of a select set of schools has dramatically increased over the 22-year period since 1987, but also the percent poverty in those schools. So the poverty concentration or the absence of any class diversity, SES diversity in many of the schools was not characteristic of the schools that I finished. This is Prince George's County. And the 22-year period has shown just a rapid increase in the racial composition of the school, minority composition of the school, but also in the increasing rates of poverty in those same schools. Richmond Public Schools, 10-year period. Richmond Public High Schools, percent free lunch eligibility. Chesterfield County, free and reduced lunch. I have to examine the data again on this one. And Henrico County. Now, why do we care about this resegregation in education? Resegregation is a threat to long persisting aspirations regarding equality of educational opportunity. A continuing concern to secure and protect the constitutional and human rights of all citizens, continuing concern to achieve improved learning outcomes and academic achievement, a continuing concern to secure improved intergroup relations, a continuing concern to secure improved long-term benefits in social mobility, work, and income, a continuing concern to secure social justice and democracy. School desegregation at its core is about access to high-quality educational resources. Arguably, that means access to a rich curriculum and to excellent teachers. The data suggests that we are, in many places, long ways away from accomplishing that goal. We recently had the opportunity to come together for our class reunion. I won't tell you what the number was. You can figure that one out, I think. But we had the opportunity to revisit our memories of some of the excellent teachers we had. However, we had those excellent teachers because of segregation and discrimination. They were not able to do the things they were capable of doing. So the blocked opportunity had the effect of giving us exceptional teachers in all subject areas. One of the cases I had an opportunity to work on was the San Francisco case. Here, what you'll see is some of the evidence of the structural disparities. If you look at Lowell High School in 2010, Lowell High School has 16 honors and academic honors courses and another 24 AP courses, yet it has only a 13% minority enrollment, school percent Black and Latino. The structure of the schools there shows that African American and Latino students attend schools that have the fewest or no AP courses. That's an administrative decision. I was an expert witness in the Gratz v. Michigan, in the Gratz case for the University of Michigan. I had the assignment of examining the admissions formula to determine the disparities. I had the opportunity to look at applicants to the University of Michigan who were graduates of the Detroit metropolitan area schools. Here's another structural example. Black students in the Detroit metropolitan area who were applicants to the University of Michigan that year attended schools, 71% attended schools that had 3 or fewer AP courses. Hispanic students, 51%, attended schools that had 3 or fewer AP courses. The admissions formula at the University of Michigan gave extra points for a strong curriculum and students having taken a rigorous set of courses. These structural barriers to access to quality education limited the access to points in the admissions formula for African American students and Latino students. One other example from research that we've done on the high school cohort graduating in 2002 in the state of Illinois. We conducted a study that examined the distribution of high-quality teachers. So the Illinois Education Research Council constructed a teacher quality index and looked at its distribution across the schools in the state of Illinois. The Teacher Quality Index shows that teacher quality is related to school poverty levels. The differences continue across all poverty groupings. So on the one hand, where you see in the lowest poverty schools, they have just under 50% of all of their teachers scoring in the highest quartile. Fully 75+% score in the 2 highest quartiles of teacher quality. By contrast, in the highest poverty schools, you can barely see any indication of teachers in the highest quartile. It was estimated that students in that class, minority students, had access to fewer than 12%, no more than 12% of teachers who scored in the highest quartile, 12%. So the high school percent minority distribution looks almost like the high school percent poor distribution for the Teacher Quality Index. One of the implications of this is that even in instances when students have AP courses, but they have AP courses from teachers who are in those lower quartiles, even though the AP curriculum is a national curriculum, it's a fixed curriculum, the students do not get the benefit of enrichment from those courses. So they do not score 3 or higher on the AP test. They do not get the boost from taking those high-quality courses. So, here's what Du Bois said. The proper education of any people includes sympathetic touch between teacher and pupil. Knowledge on the part of the teacher, not simply of the individual taught, but of his surroundings and background, and the history of his class and group. Such contact between pupils and between teacher and pupil on the basis of perfect social equality, as will increase this sympathy and knowledge. Facilities for education and equipment and housing, and the promotion of such extracurricular activities as will tend to induct the child into life. A statement was made over 8 decades ago. How do we get there? I want to talk just briefly about this set of statistics that you've seen in terms of the distribution of access to quality teachers, to quality resources, to quality schooling experiences, as a function of what Alan Kirchhoff calls allocation theory, or describes through allocation theory. He argues that so much of what we've done in sociology in trying to explain status attainment outcomes, we've focused on socialization. But he argues that allocation has been very powerful, that there are agents who make allocative decisions, and sometimes they make those decisions without the input of the client or customer, or in this case, the student and the student's family. He points to allocative decisions like decisions made by school boards about where to place high-quality educational programs. He points to allocative decisions such as those made by counselors regarding where to place students within a school curriculum. Oftentimes, these decisions are made without input from the student's family or on the part of the student. And in many instances, especially for African American, Latino, and poor students, these decisions are extremely consequential in reducing and limiting the educational opportunities that they have. How might we best consider how to address this? Well, one of the things that I've been saying for a long, long time, and I'm again thankful to Professor Ryan for quoting Judge Marriage's statement. In too much of our work, we conflate integration to mean no more than desegregation. Integration is not an endpoint. There is no particular combination of bodies of different colors and hues or gender that create or sustain integration. Desegregation is necessary but not sufficient. In 1952, Gordon Allport gave us 4 conditions for successfully integrating previously segregated groups. Those 4 conditions required that we bring the groups together with equal status, that they be provided an opportunity for cooperative teamwork, for shared outcomes would be the 3rd, and the most difficult one was that they would be brought together with the full support of the adult and legal authorities in that context. In their recent review of the research studying desegregation of the workplace, whether it was desegregation along gender or desegregation along race-ethnic lines, they found that the most difficult of those 4 to find was that 4th one, with the full support of the adult and legal authorities in that space. Until we begin to do that, we will not reap the benefits of diversity in our learning experiences. That's an essential component of it. We can get the benefits of increased intergroup relations, improve intergroup relations. We can get the benefits of some access to broadened social networks Joe Mills Braddock and I did research on the importance of accessing these broader social networks in desegregated schooling contexts. In our research, we found that blacks who had those desegregated experiences tend to perpetuate those desegregated experiences, as did whites, as did Latino. Having them early on in school lent itself to having adult choices that led to more desegregated experiences, both in the workplace and housing, and in some instances in social spheres. We also found that they provided access to a completely richer set of occupational choices in desegregated workplaces, which oftentimes led to higher salaries, higher income for both black and Latino. That work has recently been replicated with new data, and the finding stands. The work of Bowen and Bach in looking at access to high-level opportunities in the corporate world, in the scientific world, that work stressed the importance of using affirmative action strategies to get students of color into selective universities. Absent being able to access those kinds of networks in school spaces, educational spaces in higher education, it would be difficult to desegregate or to have an opportunity to actually integrate those higher echelons of the corporate sector. In many instances, we are faced with the opportunity to find ways to improve our likelihood of being able to produce an educational core of teachers who are actually capable of delivering on that promise of school desegregation and integration. But we can do that. We can indeed do that by the training that we can offer to teachers in professional development. It is through developing that kind of teacher corps that we'll have an opportunity to achieve Du Bois's admonition that every child actually deserves and merits that kind of teacher. Thank you.
Give me 1 second. I can't find the mouse part of this. That was tricky. Assistance? Yeah, I have PowerPoint.
Yes. It's here.
Up. Can't click. These computers. Got it. Good morning, everybody. I am so excited to see you all here. I was thinking about this presentation and knew that I was going to be on a panel with luminaries that I just can't even believe I'm sitting next to, and also thinking about what they were going to be talking about. And I knew Jim, had this really compelling legal story. I didn't know that it was going to include punching people in the nose, but that really upped the ante in terms of interest. And then Bill has done so much work on segregation and resegregation and what that means for students. And then I was charged with talking about the contemporary trends related to school segregation in the Richmond region, numbers, So I was thinking, and of course I turned to Facebook because clearly that's where one can go to get creative ideas. And I remembered that my second grade classmate had recently scanned in a picture of our class at William Fox Elementary School in 1987, which is right here. And it did beg the question of, what he is up to that he's scanning in his elementary class pictures, but I appreciate it.
And so I'm showing you this picture of my classroom at Fox in 1987. I'm not going to tell you where I am, but if you look for the small child wearing full Laura Ingalls Wilder regalia, that's me. I'm in the second row, so you can't really see. But this picture is to show you, two things. One, the numbers that I'm going to present here are about children and about their educational and life trajectories. And two, the example of William Fox really helps illustrate these three takeaways that I want you to leave this presentation with. So here's what's happened to William Fox. For those of you who aren't local, Fox is a beautiful historic school. I think it just celebrated its 100-year anniversary, located in the heart of the Fan in the city. In 1987, when I was in second grade at Fox, it was about 35% white and 65% black. Fast forward about 5 years, 43% white, 54% black, and 3% people or students identifying with other races. So you can start to see this small growth in multiracial diversity. 2010, the school is now majority white, almost 2/3 white. 62% of William Fox's students are white, 30% are black in a city school district that's 80% black. 4% Latino, 3% Asian, and 1% identifying as two or more races. So that transition really illustrates these three big takeaways from this presentation. The first is that the region's enrollment has become increasingly multiracial. We are not talking about a black and white story any longer. The second is that very high proportions of black students and increasingly Latino students remain isolated in schools that are segregated by both race and poverty. And the third is that segregation is rising within the same district. So the example of Fox, this concentration of white students in a single elementary school in the city, illustrates the fact that there's a lot that can and should be done within district lines, even as there's a great deal of segregation between districts today. So I'm going to illustrate all this with data. A lot of it is drawn from a new report from the Civil Rights Project called Miles to Go, and then some of it, a little bit of it, is from my dissertation. So this is the enrollment by race in Richmond, Petersburg metropolitan area in 1989 and 2010. This illustrates the multiracial character of schools in our region today. We've gone from a situation where white students made up about 60% of the metro's enrollment to one where they make up about 51%. Black students have remained a constant proportion of the enrollment at about 37%. The real growth has been in the Latino student population, which grew from 2% to 6% in the past 2 decades. But at the same time, even as we're growing more diverse, high levels of segregation remain. Bill talked a little bit about intensely segregated schools or hyper-segregated schools that are 90 to 100% non-white. Richmond, 35% of our students, of our black students in this region today attend a hyper-segregated school. Of those, 8% go to a setting that's 99 to 100% non-white. Now you can see a small drop-off from 1999 to 2010, and that's likely related to the increasing suburbanization of black students in the metropolitan area. But remember what I said about segregation growing within the same district. That's increasingly affecting black students in the suburbs. The same statistics for Latino students in the region. You can see much lower shares of Latino students, 14%, are attending intensely segregated schools, but that's increased a great deal since 1989. Bill also talked about the ongoing overlap between racial concentration and poverty concentration. In 2010, 75% of the students enrolled in one of those hyper-segregated 90 to 100% non-white schools were low income. In the apartheid school settings, that same figure was 85%. So intense racial isolation almost always coincides with intense poverty concentration. So I want to talk about that third takeaway, the segregation growing within districts, but also still remaining very significant between districts in the metropolitan area. And I'm calling these school-related boundary lines, both the district lines and the school attendance zone lines, fences. And I'm pulling that from a quote from Thurgood Marshall in the Milliken decision in 1974. He said, "We deal here with the right of all of our children, whatever their race, to an equal start in life and to an equal opportunity to reach their full potential as citizens. Those children who have been denied the right in the past deserve better than to see fences thrown up to deny them that right in the future." And those fences that he was talking about were the city suburban lines that were separating Detroit public schools from the surrounding counties. This is what's happened over the past 20 years, Richmond. In 1989, 72% of all segregation in the Richmond metropolitan area could be attributed to what was happening between districts across those district lines. Hugely dramatic shift. In 2010, about half of segregation can be attributed to what's happening between the city and the suburban districts. But almost 50% can be attributed to what's happening within a single district in the metropolitan area. So we need to think about this on two fronts. Let me explain to you a little bit about the increase within districts. This is the Black-White Dissimilarity Index, which can be read as if you've got a value of 0.61, about 61% of white students would need to change schools in order to achieve perfect integration with black students. So the red line is Henrico County, the blue line is Richmond City, and the, unclear what color that is, but yellowish green, is Chesterfield County. And you can see that Black-white dissimilarity in schools for both Richmond City and Henrico County has increased over the past 20 years, and it's actually quite high. Now, the example of Fox helps explain a little bit about what's going on in the city, with even though whites make up 10% of the enrollment, really concentrating in just a handful of area elementary schools in Richmond. In Henrico, the region really needs to think carefully about how we approach rezoning processes. Anytime a new school is built or one is closed, you have to redraw the attendance boundaries associated with those schools. All three area districts have done that recently. Richmond's in the process of doing so right now. Well, in 2008, when Henrico County rezoned, when they built that new high school, they had the opportunity to think about the underlying neighborhood demographics and to draw those lines in a way that promoted school diversity. That is not what happened. Here's the example of Henrico High School. Just prior to the rezoning, the white students made up about 17% of the Henrico High School zone, which is granted very low. But under all three of the proposals, and then the eventually adopted one, the share of white students in the Henrico High School zone shrank to less than 1%. Meanwhile, the zones for Deep Run, Freeman, and Godwin remained about 90% white. So that's an illustration of what's happening within districts that's increasing segregation. Highland Springs, also a very isolated zone. But let's talk about what's happening between districts, because that's what Marriage's decision was about 40 years ago. This is the urban and suburban school enrollment by race in the Richmond metropolitan area. You can see over all three time periods that black students made up about 90% of city school enrollment, shrinking to 80% in the most recent year, but that was largely because of an increase in the Latino student enrollment in urban schools. But also a rising share of black students in our suburban settings, up to about 30% in 2010. Meanwhile, white students have made up consistently about 10% of the urban school enrollment, and a very fast shrinking share of the suburban school enrollment. So we have a lot of opportunity out in those suburbs. This is what it looks like visually over three time periods, 1992, 1999, and 2008. Each pie chart represents an elementary school. Green represents the share of black students in the elementary school, and red represents the share of white students. So this is 1992. Those dark black lines are the district boundaries. You can see a very severe pattern of racial concentration in the central city, even as some of the suburban schools are becoming slightly more diverse. That's 1999. Similar pattern, but you can see that just across the city-suburban boundary line in Henrico County, particularly in that central zone, you're seeing a rising number of very intensely segregated elementary schools. And this is 2010. I'll do that again. I like to do this back and forth. This is 2010. Now, yellow represents the share of Latino students, and you can see a pattern of growing concentration of Latino students in the south side of the metropolitan area. You see a lot of diversity, multiracial diversity in the outskirts of the counties, but that same predominant pattern of really concentrated racial segregation in the city and now just across the boundary line in the counties prevails. Overlap between racial concentration and poverty concentration. The dark green in the pie represents the share of students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. And then just to up the ante a little bit more, the Brookings Institution last year released a report that showed that 5 of the 20 fastest growing exurban communities in the United States, in terms of the share of the white population, are in the Richmond metropolitan area. That means that the scope of the problem that Judge Marriage identified 40 years ago is growing larger. Those counties were New Kent, Louisa, Caroline, Goochland, and Powhatan. I can't leave you on that note, and I'm going to tee up the next panel, I think, with this, a regional comparison, an example of what could be done. This is Louisville, Jefferson County compared to Richmond, Chesterfield, and Henrico. School and housing segregation. So the red line represents black-white segregation at the neighborhood level, and the grayish-blue line represents school segregation. Now you can see in Jefferson County that they have completely disconnected patterns of school segregation from patterns of housing segregation. Patterns of school segregation are extremely low, and this is related to their student assignment policy that you're about to hear more about, but essentially they try to make sure that each school in the city-suburban community reflects a mix of kids from different neighborhoods. So very low levels of school segregation, and look at how fast their housing segregation is declining at the same time. And that's because families in the Jefferson County, Louisville area know that they can move to any part of the region and attend a high-quality, diverse school. In the Richmond Metro, by contrast, we haven't done anything like that. It was on the table 40 years ago, though. We have very high and extremely intertwined levels of neighborhood and school segregation. That's because we're not doing anything about it. I'll leave you with that thought. And then you'll hear more about exactly what Louisville and a couple of other places' plans look like. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Beck.
Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to defer asking any questions specifically to our panelists. We're going to go directly to the audience because we've had 3 very engaging presentations, and I'm sure you'll want to engage the panel. Yes, sir, in the back. And students are coming to you with the mic.
Thad Williamson from UR. Thanks again for the excellent panel. I have a question for James Ryan. I mean, in your book, you basically walk through the ways in which attempts to achieve a real remedy through the existing law have basically run their course, both at the federal and state level, and it sort of reached a dead end. And then, so the response is maybe we can do something locally, regionally, at the state level. But then we heard Michael Paul Williams this morning say Virginia never does anything unless it's forced to, and saying that regionalism is as dead as it's ever been on his account. And so my question, just looking at this, doesn't it require, or wouldn't it require some sort of federal constitutional amendment actually establishing an equal right to public education to get real leverage on this problem to make more than marginal changes, to have that legal basis in place to do something that can be more than just a little bit of a change?
Thanks for the question. I I don't think that we're likely to see a constitutional amendment to the federal Constitution. And even if there were, I'm not sure that alone would be sufficient. There's a right to education in the Virginia Constitution that has been read to require equal educational opportunities. You could read into that the right to attend, where feasible, an integrated school, just like the Connecticut Supreme Court read that into their own similar constitution. So I don't think that an edict that just talks about equal educational opportunity, either at the federal or the state level, would be enough. And my sense from looking over the history is that to the extent you have to rely on outside forces like courts, they're unreliable. They don't seem willing over the long run to be that forceful in imposing solutions or into enforcing rights to equal educational opportunity. So I think at the end of the day, for better or for worse, it comes down to a question of political will. And the question today is the same question 40 years ago, namely, is there sufficient political will to do something about this? And there's reason to be pessimistic that there is. But I wouldn't hang a lot of hope on some outside force coming to the rescue and forcing those in the Richmond metropolitan area to do something that they're steadfastly opposed to.
Another question.
Yes.
Another hand. Yes.
Hi. My question is for Professor Trent, and I guess all of you who are impacting students at the educational level. I guess if we can't change the exterior of things, perhaps within the institutions, can we at least try, or how do we go about changing the mentality of those coming out of educational institutions so that at least they can start thinking of diversity? And you made a comment, I think, about well, we know how in academic programs in schools, the honors programs are always majority white, and that there's a tendency to track African American students away from those sort of programs. So at least in the educational institutions, how can we go about training the social workers, the school counselors to stop tracking African Americans away from the academically more rigorous programs? I guess that's the question.
Thank you for the question. There are examples, I'm not going to get the names right, but there are examples of school districts that have completely detracked. It takes the leadership of a district superintendent, it takes the leadership of principals to be able to do so. When they detracked, they also eliminated all of those, what we would think of as remedial or low-level courses within those schools. So there are strategies that can be used that immediately begin to address the issue of all students having access to a quality curriculum. There are additional things that need to be done in terms of providing the sorts of supports to teachers in those kinds of schools that enable them to actually work effectively with students for whom there will be some catch-up. In other instances, when school districts have desegregated and have attempted to overcome that particular problem of tracking, one of the things that we've always encouraged is that you have to begin to build the experiences of younger students so that by the time they're eligible for AP courses, they've actually acquired the set of skills. So you can begin to what you would call sort of ladder those students up in earlier courses so that they acquire the kinds of skills that they would need. But we really need to address the issue of professional development to enable teachers to be able to acquire the kinds of skills that give them the capabilities of employing those sorts of strategies within schools. But that also entails principals managing schools in a way and superintendents of districts supporting and encouraging that kind of effort.
I might add that as one who lives in that world every day, I am teaching pre-service teachers how to teach in elementary schools. I'll be the first to acknowledge we need huge changes within colleges of education. And there's specific reasons why we have programs like Teach for America and programs of that nature, because there have been some fundamental structural issues with the way in which we are preparing teachers to go into schools today. And so it's exciting to me to engage with University of Richmond, BCU, and to do this work internally as well as externally, because it's no surprise that when I go into my class tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to have 35 young white female students who are coming to me, and for many of them, I'm the first African American professor that they've had in their college experience in the School of Education. There's something that fundamentally is not right with that either. So we've got to try to tackle this, in many different areas and ways. I see a gentleman has a mic in the back.
Yes, we've looked at the issues of federal courts here, and it looks like the Yankees aren't going to save us in this particular generation, as they have in the past. The state has a constitutional obligation to provide quality education for every student under our Constitution, and standards of quality that are supposed to uphold that. We know that in really high poverty schools, it costs 2.2 times as much to provide a quality education as it does in middle and upper middle income schools. And yet the state has a composite index formula that funds the city of Richmond and Petersburg and other central city high poverty schools at a lower level than it funds suburban schools. Is that a legitimate court challenge in Virginia, and why aren't we doing it? Mr. Ryan.
Is this being recorded? Yes, it is a legitimate basis, and I'm not sure why, to be honest. School finance litigation has been brought in almost every state in the country, including in Virginia. There was a case brought years ago that sought recognition of a right to equal funding, and the Supreme Court of Virginia rejected that claim, even though it recognized that education is a fundamental right. A number of advocates since then have thought that Virginia is ripe for a challenge to the adequacy of funding rather than to the equity. That is to say, you could argue that even if the Constitution doesn't create or guarantee a right to equal funding, at least guarantees a right to adequate funding. And the kind of proof that you would bring in a case like that is similar to the evidence that you were talking about in terms of the costs to provide education to different groups of students and whether the state is meeting its obligation. The difficulty with those suits is that they take forever. Mark Yudof, Genevieve heard me say this the other day. Mark Yudof, who's now the president of the University of California, started his career as a law and education scholar, and he compared school finance litigation to a Russian novel, saying it's long, tedious, and everybody dies in the end, which gives you a sense of just how long it takes.
In the back.
Good morning. I'd like to revisit the question that was addressed briefly last night about private school populations. The data that Genevieve showed, and I believe the data that Dr. Trent showed as well, dealt with the attendance in our public school system. At least in the Richmond area, and especially in the city of Richmond, large numbers of our students don't go to the public schools. And I believe the tendency is for that group of students who go to private schools instead to be primarily white and primarily affluent. So I'd like to ask the panel to address that issue. How do we incorporate looking at those students when we're looking at school integration of our student population?
I'll try to answer that, Paul.
You're right. There are a number of school zones in Richmond City with really high percentages of kids opting out of the public school, their public zoned elementary school, and going to private school. The zone with the highest attendance at private schools is actually the Mumford zone. Mumford Elementary is about 90% white, but 70% of the kids in that zone go to a private school. It is right geographically near a lot of the private schools, but that's not the case in other parts of the city necessarily. And you're right that if, you know, and I think RPS has thought about this, and they initiated something called the Choice Campaign a few years back, if I remember correctly. I wasn't here at the time, but this idea that we bring parents back into the school system. And I think this conference, one of the goals of it is to get people thinking about the value of their local public school, and what the experiences their kids would have in a diverse school would do for them as they move through life. But it is definitely something we need to be thinking carefully about.
Right here in the front.
I just had a quick question. Dr. Trent, when you talked about the 4 conditions for integration, could you speak a little more on can you flesh a little more for me, the full support of the adult and legal authorities, what that would look like? Thanks.
Good thing you ask easy questions, right? In many instances, and I'll use my home department as an example. We have one of the most diverse graduate enrollments of any selective university in higher education. We've graduated substantial numbers of PhDs who are African American and Latino. For years, when we were there, we had one of the best desegregated departments you could have. We did not have an integrated department. There were few examples of the faculty across color or gender lines working together. There were fewer examples of our construction of multi-race, multi-gender research teams. So those would be practical manifestations of how you would go about demonstrating that the diversity that we claim to value actually works. So we have, not so much consciously, but I think with good intention, and certainly with intentionality, more of us have deliberately constructed those kinds of experiences for our students. So currently, many of the research projects that are going on by faculty in our college are quite diverse. And it's an opportunity for students to learn to respect the competencies of folks who are quite different from themselves. But I think in many instances, we have to do the sorts of deliberate things that, in fact, are intended to convey that message. Whether it's about gender or race and ethnicity, or in those instances where it's necessary, certainly about class. It means that the effort on the part of the educator in this instance to construct experiences in classrooms that are in fact diverse. Many of you have already seen the experience that when you do group assignments at the college level or at the high school level, the African American kids or the Latino kids never get chosen. And so they're oftentimes, that's in a school that's desegregated. And the instructor never does anything to alter that, or never seeks to find alternative ways of trying to construct those group-based experiences. The best evidence we have about the absence of this kind of adult support or the support of the legal authorities is simply to look at the disparities in discipline. There is no way to explain the degree of disparity in suspensions and expulsions from schools based on race disparities, when students are expelled or suspended, if they're African American or Latino and male, at 3 times or 4 times the rate of their population and their presence in the school. Those kinds of lack of due process practices are very educative for the students. They learn, both the students who are victims and the students who are not. They learn who is supposed to be the victim. And there is a tremendous amount of recidivism in those suspension rates. And so we need to address those sort of practical things. In one case I was a part of, the school district doesn't want to acknowledge this, but we were actually able to identify the teachers in the school building who were responsible for a disproportionate share of referrals to special education, for suspensions, for expulsions, for unbalanced disciplinary treatment. Schools have the ability to track that information, and they can intervene with those educators who need assistance in overcoming those patterns of behavior.
We have time.
I'm sorry, go ahead. I just think we have to be very intentional about looking for those ways in which we are failing to communicate to the students that we fully respect their intellect, their ability to learn, and their right to be in those schools learning.
Thank you. I wish we had time for your questions, sir, but I've got quite a few people telling me that we're just about there. I encourage all of you to please engage with our panelists as well as with one another. We knew that this would happen, but this is a great problem to have, that we want to continue this dialogue this way. Thank you very much for your participation, and we'll now take our break.
Yes, if we can give this panel another round of applause.
That was really nice.